thank you everybody for attending. My name is Eric Clay. I'm the Director of Marketing at Flare, and we are really excited to have two special guests today. We have Andrew McCabe, who is the former Deputy Director of the FBI and former Acting Director of the FBI, and Gregory Crabb, who is the former CISO of the US Postal Service. Finally, last but not least, we have Norman Menz, who is the CEO of Flare, who will be conducting our interview today. As we go, I would encourage you to put questions in our Q&A, which we will get to towards the end of the webinar. But Norman, take it away from here.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And again, a special welcome to Andy and Greg. It's great to have you both here. And I know I'm excited, and I think the audience is excited to hear about your experience and the background. So today's webinar is called Confidence in Crisis. And the thought and theme of it is really, given your diverse backgrounds, working with some very interesting challenges, exciting challenges, et cetera. How do we convey that into going from the public sector government into the private sector? And thinking about, oftentimes in cybersecurity and private sector, when we're dealing with crisis, they don't often, sometimes they do, but they don't often involve life and death, health situations, et cetera. And certainly when we deal with these at a government level, more often than not, they may involve that as well. And so we'd like to draw from your confidence in those crisis situations that you've both experienced. And so that's kind of the background and the theme. And we're going to start off with some discussions around nation state activity, and then moving into more general cybercrime activities as well. But before we get started, Eric's given a little bit of background, but we'd like to maybe get an intro and a bio from each of you. Andy, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks so much, Norman, for having Greg and I meet with you and your clients and customers today. My name is Andrew McCabe. I was a career FBI agent, 21 years in the FBI, and I ended my time there as Deputy Director. It's a unique and challenging job, one that tends to wear people out pretty quickly. As the Deputy Director, you're in charge of all investigative operations and intelligence collection for the nation's domestic intelligence service and the federal law enforcement agencies. So great time at the FBI. I would not change a thing. Since leaving the FBI in 2018, I've been an analyst for CNN on national security and law enforcement issues. I also teach a class in national security law and policy at George Mason University's Schar School of Graduate School of Government. And I do a little bit of consulting with my good friend, Greg Crabb. So I'll hand it over to Greg now.
Thanks, Andrew. And thank you, Norman, for giving us an opportunity to share our experience and lessons and get to know your clients a bit more. And Greg Crabb, I was a 25-year federal law enforcement officer with the United States Postal Inspection Service. The Postal Inspection Service investigates mail fraud, mail theft, bombs in the mail. I had the good fortune of being the Chief Information Security Officer for the Postal Service for the last 6 years of my career. I was a gun-toting CISO, which was a rarity. And obviously, those experiences from a law enforcement perspective we'll talk about today, along with my experiences as in working with Andrew very closely through the years, really help us to form this transition that we've made to help companies really understand how to use threat intelligence to inform risk decisions. And so from a consulting perspective, we often get the opportunity to help organizations make that jump. And we'll talk more today about threat-led intelligence in order to inform controls in cybersecurity. And so that's what we do at 10-8 Cyber, which is our consulting organization. And again, thank you for having us, Norman.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, again, great to have you both here. Greg, it's interesting, jokes aside, like I look at as a user and consumer of the Postal Service as something that's very reliable, very safe. My mail arrives in my mailbox and gets delivered. But when you stop and think about all of the challenges, you mentioned them, we've got crimes being committed, all of this stuff that you have to do in mass. I think it's really interesting, and probably you've got some amazing stories to share there as well.
Yeah, Norman, thank you. I had the opportunity to meet with the leadership of the Postal Inspection Service a couple of weeks ago, and I reiterated that they have the best job in the world. There was nothing greater every morning waking up knowing that I had the responsibility to provide secure communications and package services to 160 million addresses across the United States. And, protecting that letter carrier that stopped at your mailbox today, there's no greater responsibility, in my opinion. So you can just imagine all of the things that we got involved in, or they get involved in the performance of those security activities. So it was a great feeling every morning to wake up knowing that that was my responsibility.
Well, it's amazing. Terrific. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to just start off with a very broad topical question. And so I'd love to get your feelings in terms of what are some of the significant trends in cybercrime that you're seeing in 2023?
Sure. So I'll start that one off, Greg. Excuse me. I from my perspective, Norman, it's I guess you never really get that far away from the thing that you spent most of your career doing. So I tend to look at threats today, particularly in the work that we do with our cyber clients, in the same way that we looked at threats facing America when I was in the FBI. And I think one of the roles of not just the FBI, but the U.S. intelligence community writ large that people don't think about very often is protecting intelligence assets. So in addition to the work that the Bureau does working with victims in the private sector and private citizens across their criminal and national security missions, they also spend a lot of time trying to understand those threats that are coming after our classified and sensitive intelligence. And so they're, in a way, kind of the country's cyber protection system, right? So in the Bureau, we worked very closely with the CIA and with the NSA in conducting that sort of threat intelligence collection that you and your clients do every day in their own responsibilities. And so in doing that work, we of course think about the situations we face from our most significant adversaries overseas. That's kind of first priority in that threat ranking process that we all go through. And you don't have to really, be too creative to understand who are the major players there. It's of course Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are the ones that really kept us busy. So I think as we try to assess where those threats are coming from, where the most significant, most highly skilled, highly trained, targeted threats are coming from, I think you have to look at those same groups of actors. And as we look across the globe and see all sorts of different levels of instability, the conflict in Ukraine, the great power rivalry between the United States and China, and overlay those onto our historic interactions with those nations, we know first and foremost that those threats never cease. This is a full-time, permanent job, watching what those adversaries are doing. And secondly, they are constantly getting better, constantly developing and extending their reach and their impact through not only working with their own intelligence services, their own military intelligence infrastructure, but also with those criminal groups that each one of these actors cultivates, directs, sometimes specifically tasks, other times just tacitly leaves alone and allows to continue to operate within their realm. So we really break it down in terms of those four major actors, and you can trace the activity, the major global threat activity in the areas of ransomware, in the areas of hacking and dumping, and all the kind of traditional cyber threats that we are all worried about on a day-to-day basis in our business and our own organizations. That activity, and to some degree, I think, is traceable back to the instability that we see across the global specter, predominantly from Russia. China is a very close second, maybe first if you're evaluating in terms of sheer volume of attacks. And then, of course, Iran and North Korea, much smaller in scale, but proven to be very effective over the last few years.
And I think taking up on what Andrew's saying, China is much more silent than the other three. And, when we look at what we're seeing on the technical side of the attack space, the sophistication and increasing frequency of the attacks is just increasing. It's going to increase. the automated nature of these adversaries and the tooling that they're creating, the leveraging of artificial intelligence to drive the impact and frequency of attack, I think all of those factors are going to increase. One area that I'm particularly passionate about recently is the increased focus on exploiting weaknesses in the implementation of cryptographic technologies. And everybody's talking about quantum, but we don't even do as a community cryptography properly in our organizations. And you look at Circle CI, you look at LastPass, we have a lot of examples over the last 6 to 8 months or so where cryptographic attacks have really been prevalent and caused some of the biggest damage. And I think we're going to see more and more of that in the time to come, since cryptography is such the basis of all the security that we depend upon.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Greg. Is there any recommendations or suggestions you could give to the audience about things that they should be doing to enhance their adoption of either better cryptography technology, or is it? Let me rephrase the question. Is it an issue of not using the right technology, or is it an issue of not adopting it correctly?
I think it's both. And it starts with knowing what cryptography you are using. A lot of organizations depend upon their CIO shops and their technologists to make certificate management to implement cryptography. And they don't even know where it's being used. Just, fundamental, know your hardware, know your software. I think we need to start talking about, do you even know where your cryptographic artifacts are? And then how are you applying those cryptographic artifacts in your organizations with the different tool sets that you have available? And do you have tool sets available that you can leverage in order to be able to protect those properly?
Yeah, interesting. Excellent. So I wanted to, maybe this has been a good overview so far. Andy, I want to hit you with a harder question though. So recently, Christopher Wray, FBI director, made a statement before a congressional committee that China has a 50-to-1 advantage over the US in terms of the number of hackers versus the number of defenders that we have. What do you think this means for the US and US companies at a functional level? And what are the potential implications of that?
Well, Norman, I think first and foremost, it's a very effective statistic, and it's one that I'm sure Director Wray hoped would get the attention of a lot of folks in the private sector who do this stuff every day. I have no doubt about the accuracy of his multiplier there, and quite frankly, it's something that we've confronted in the intelligence community for years. China is probably the best example of the adversary that makes up for sometimes a lack of technology, or let's say historically a lack of capability and technology, simply by flooding the zone with personnel. But to really get your head around the difference in terms of, or the scope of the Chinese effort in cyberspace right now, we are not. I think we tend to come to this issue thinking about, like Greg was mentioning earlier in our conversation earlier, individuals, the hooded kind of guys huddled over the keyboard, or then maybe larger, like thinking about hacking groups, particularly criminal hacking groups, in terms of like platoon-sized groups, right? Dozen or more people acting in concert. China is running an aggressive cyber program on division and company level size, right? This is like massive, highly organized sections of the Chinese military that are trained and deployed every single day in a relentless campaign of targeting Western private entities for many reasons, to obviously take classified sensitive data, for geopolitical reasons, and predominantly in pursuit of economic dominance, in addition to military and geopolitical dominance. So I think it's a really helpful reminder from the director that we are facing a significant, highly structured, well-deployed adversary that is at this 24 hours a day with thousands and thousands of highly trained, highly skilled folks. This is not the same China that we confronted 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, I would say, but certainly 10 to 15 years ago, very different experience with Chinese state-sponsored hacking activity. They are better trained, more sophisticated, more targeted in what they're doing, and incredibly well armed. It's a massive, massive effort that we're kind of facing.
Yeah, given that, Greg, I'd be interested in your perspective. So you talked about the four major actors, including North Korea. Greg, do you think it's fair to say that to some extent, like private industry almost has more to worry about because they're being targeted both for financial reasons as well as theft of intellectual property? And I guess what I'm assuming in this question is maybe when government agencies are being targeted, they're primarily being targeted for intellectual property or sensitive information.
Yeah, I think, Norman, I think that's a good question. I believe that the motives of the actors are obviously extremely important here. When you look at North Korea, it's all about the money, as you indicate. When you look at China, it's not about the money, it's about the intellectual property. When you look at Russia, it's about critical infrastructure, but also they have this band of thieves that they work with, which are their cybercrime syndicates that are, quasi arm of their weapons of instruments of crime. And they're money motivated, and they are also objectives on critical infrastructure motivated. And so I think that your question is a really good one. I think a lot of organizations are worried about their money when they defend themselves and don't spend as much time on thinking about their intellectual property from a protection perspective. How many organizations put in DLP solutions to identify when their intellectual property is walking out the door? Is it tagged? Are you marking and tagging your intellectual property in a way to be able to protect it like you do the account information and social security numbers of your customers, et cetera? I don't think we as a industry are playing those two threat vectors equally.
Yeah, if I could add on to that, Norman, I think that diversity of motivation, really, the way it turns up on your client's doorstep every day is people engaged in sectors and industries that you would not typically think would be targets of state-sponsored activity are absolutely sponsors of state, targets of that sort of activity. I remember back to the maybe early 2010s when we started noticing massive exfiltration by Chinese cyber actors of US healthcare data. And part of our struggle at that time was like, why are they going after this data? What's the advantage that the Chinese government seeks to build up by going after U.S. healthcare companies, right? Personal information from U.S. health insurance entities, from hospital systems, things like that. So now, in retrospect, after things like the OPM hack that we, of course, all suffered through for a while there, we understand that they were playing a long game in amassing or aggregating massive amounts of personal health data that they can then use in their own development of their healthcare system, of biomedical research, of, to kind of advance the ball in terms of their ability to test out new medications and theories and things like that against historical US health data. So in those places where you don't think you're going to be a target, it's only because you're not thinking creatively enough. Literally everything is on the board right now, simply because you've got states doing their own work, all the way down to states who are hosting and directing criminal groups who are doing it for the money, but also in concert with whatever their national organization is trying to accomplish as well.
Yeah, very interesting point there. I think that's what's exciting about our field is there's creativity both on the defensive side and clearly on the offensive side as well. We seem to keep going back to China, which isn't a big surprise, but one of the things, so our group here at FLAIR 3 weeks ago released a report about the Russian threat actor group, No Name 57, where they're conducting some hacktivism exercises against Western organizations and companies that are sympathetic to Ukraine and the current conflict there. And so we've seen an increase of activity there, a lot of denial of service and things of that nature that we expect. And obviously with ties to the Russian government, but they're almost private individuals that are getting together in support of this through some levels of coordination. If we now pivot then back to China and we look at what's going on with the potential conflict over the Taiwan Strait, given the capabilities that you alluded to before with China, what do you think we might anticipate? Either state-sponsored or other hacktivism activities targeted and escalating, similar to Russia? Will it be at another magnitude that we haven't experienced before?
I think so. I think really the possibilities here are endless, and it concerns me a little bit. Many of us spent a lot of time talking about what the expected cyber activity, malicious cyber activity at the initiation of the conflict in Ukraine. And unfortunately, we didn't see quite what we saw sitting at home, watching the news, reading our bulletins and things that we go to stay informed, didn't seem to live up to the predictions of doom and gloom and turning the lights out all across Europe that a lot of people were talking about. In reality, the cyber attacks in the first month or two of the conflict were actually much more intense and would have been more impactful, but for the Ukrainians' really impressive preparation, obviously backstopped by a lot of assistance from the West. So I think it was worse than many people believe it was. And that feeling that it didn't live up to expectations has kind of generated a false sense of security. Personally, I don't think we have seen the extent of what we will see in terms of cyber attacks related to the Ukraine conflict. What concerns me the most, Norman, is where Russian desperation will go as they try to escalate their impact on the conflict. So it's no question, everybody knows Russia is really on the back foot militarily. They're not experiencing nearly the level of success that everybody expected. As the conflict drags on, as their traditional weapons stores begin to get really low, as it get harder and harder to resupply and rearm themselves, reaching for cyber is a way to escalate the conflict, but to do it quietly, to do it without as many clear fingerprints as lobbing drones and missiles into Ukraine gives you. So it's an opportunity for Russia to increase their pressure, not just on the United States, but on the Western coalition right now that's keeping Ukraine in the fight. Everybody knows that current level of participation, of unity across NATO is going to be harder and harder to sustain as we go deeper into this conflict. Russia knows that as well. If they can turn up the stakes, if they can increase the cost of that unity on the Western allies, they have a better chance of scaring a few of them off, of diminishing Western support for Ukraine. One of the ways they can increase that pressure, increase those costs, is through more aggressive cyber attacks outside of Ukraine. So on the Western coalition partners, on the United States, on Great Britain, France, and others. So I'm concerned that we will see that as Russia finds themselves more behind in the conflict, gets more desperate. It's an easy way of escalating without going to something like, tactical nuclear arms and things of that nature.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of different complementary, but also maybe a little different from a technical spin perspective. I believe as Russia gets more desperate, the possibility of a poorly targeted, highly destructive attack like NotPetya increases. And I think that it's just a matter of finding that remote code execution vulnerability that they are going to be able to leverage to be able to weaponize it for their benefit and get that distributed quickly. I think will create distraction that they can misattribute or attempt to misattribute, and give them some space, as well as have the rest of the world deal with their critical infrastructure issues. I think that's a really real possibility. On the Chinese side, one of the things that I think, and I'm sure we can't have a discussion these days without AI, but one of the things that I believe that we really need to take into consideration is we're having some very good conversations about policing and regulating AI, and who knows where that's going to go in the United States. Once this, we have no control over what's going on in China, right? And I believe that as they install their ideals into the development, use, and implementation of AI in their context, I think we're going to see some very different methods of attack that we have never seen before. And I think we need to really consider where the use of that technology is going to go. And I think the facade of security and privacy that we are used to may deteriorate significantly with the extensive push to distribute technology that they make into other parts of the world, as well as installing their own homegrown AI into those technologies. So, I think that's where we see China go longer term, not as a direct attack, but as kind of this, infiltration of technology and, intelligence that is just an extension of where we're going from a technology advancement space.
Yeah, Greg, you've talked about generative AI twice now, once earlier and obviously just now. I think, fundamentally the belief is that the velocity and the sophistication, as you both talked about it, of different types of threats and attacks is going to increase. First, maybe a two-part question. Have you seen any examples of generative AI being used in any attacks? Or, and a more broader question is, can you conceive of any particular vectors that people should be looking at right now? It's kind of the unknown of the unknowns.
Very, very interesting question, Norman, and direct attribution to the weaponization of technology in the context of, was this developed through generative AI or not? On the defender's side, we're not necessarily going to see that. The intelligence community may be able to have their offensive capabilities to identify those methods and means of weaponizing AI in that manner. Andrew and I often talk about what we dealt with Facebook in the 2016 election. And as we look at how misinformation, disinformation is being used to impact us, that's at the heart of, I believe, where we need to be going as we think about understanding integrity in the information that we have to assess and make decisions on. So I think we've already seen significant attacks from the use or I'll say the manipulation of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I think that we'll see more and more of that type of attack? And, I know Andrew's very passionate about this topic.
Yeah, I think your description, Norman, as the unknown of the unknowns is pretty accurate. I think folks there are now some good conversations, even just in the last couple of weeks, about like, hey, hold on a second, what are we unleashing on ourselves? And I think Greg's comments put a better perspective on that, probably for your customers and clients, to start thinking about what are our adversaries unleashing on us, even unintentionally, as we all charge forward in the development of AI. Without the sort of kind of understood and accepted security practices in place, to kind of be a little bit more thoughtful about how we deploy and use that technology ourselves. I think we're without that, we're lost in terms of detection and understanding how to mitigate those risks once we come across them. We're literally at the edge of this cliff right now. Everybody knows, right? We're essentially ready to go over the other side, and there are just so many unknowns about how this technology is going to be able to, even just in our context for this conversation, how this technology is going to be able to embolden and arm our adversaries to come at us in cyberspace. It's impossible to even answer that, I think, at this point. So we need to start thinking about those basics that we all are currently doing, and how do we develop those basic defense techniques to kind of be prepared for what's coming, whatever that is.
Yeah. So, Andy, if we stick with this thread, right, we've all seen the statistics, right? The number of data breaches, the cost of data breaches increases every year. You alluded to before that in the private sector, it's primarily financial, right? That's the big concern that everyone thinks about. What are some of the things, given that statistic, it seems to some extent as an industry we're failing. And so I'd love to get your perspectives on where are the areas. You mentioned cryptography before, Greg, but what are the other areas that you're either commonly consulting with your clients on, or there's areas that you think that we need to lean in harder?
Norman, I think back to the way that we approached our mission in the area of economic espionage, right? So go back 15, 20 years. And economic espionage was essentially a human endeavor, right? So those companies that we consulted with, companies who'd been victimized by China, Russia, whoever, name your actor, and others who we thought would be likely candidates for that sort of activity, we would start to try to get them to think differently about understanding what constitutes a threat. And in those days, it was individuals, it was your own employees, the people who your employees are interacting with, understanding which of your human assets were really best positioned to either be malicious actors themselves or just to be targeted by malicious actors because of what they were exposed to. The development of with the ease with which our adversaries are able to do to conduct that same sort of theft of intellectual property enabled by remote means over the internet through cyber activity, just took that area of economic espionage and elevated it 100-fold. But those same conversations take place between the defenders and the likely targets, like to think differently about what is it you have might be most valuable to our adversaries, who's exposed to that material and therefore becomes a target themselves. How are you conducting the basic, we talk about all the time, cyber hygiene basics. And we know that in, 80% of problems could have been solved or at least reduced if victims had been kind of more ahead of the game in terms of cyber hygiene. Those same fundamentals still apply to this day, despite the fact that activity is up. Activity is up because it's so much easier to do. You no longer have to train intelligence officers and send them to foreign hostile countries and take the risk of them, being uncovered and thrown in jail. Everything gets done from, the intelligence service computer deployment room, and it's easy, it's clean, and no one has to worry about getting thrown in jail. So, but the same basics apply. That the idea is still the same. Our adversaries are looking for economic superiority over the United States. They know that the keys to that kingdom are in our private sector. You know, unlike many of our adversaries, our private sector owns our infrastructure, runs our infrastructure, is the generator of that information and that technology, and so that's where they're going.
That's a great point, Greg. I'd be interested extending off on that. You, as part of 10.8 Cyber, you work with boards as well. I'd be interested in your thoughts in terms of where do you feel the general level of maturity for boards is in terms of their awareness and their appreciation for the risks from cyber.
That's a very interesting question, Norman, and really is as difficult to answer as the maturity of each board. Each board is a snowflake, and the amount of knowledge and understanding that the board has relative to the technologies that they depend upon in order to be able to manage their companies really impacts their decision making, right? And so some boards, they don't understand cyber. They don't understand how cyber impacts the risk equation for their organization. That these threats seem so foreign to them because they are foreign, and there is a lot of opportunity for education on understanding how technology risk intersects this threat landscape. And for those boards that don't have the type of cyber expertise that they need, there are a lot of available resources. There's a growing number of resources. Andrew and I love to talk about this topic. It's extremely important. One phenomena that I'm concerned about is trying to eliminate the risk by not addressing it. My dear colleague, I had the great occasion to work with Joe Sullivan when he was a prosecutor in San Jose, California. And we all know Joe Sullivan's story. I saw Joe at the RSA conference right before his sentencing. And I think that his case was not unusual. He was put in a very precarious situation relative to information that he had and a due diligence that he had to report. I think that, as we see how companies need to think about cyber, some companies and companies' boards are saying, hey, I don't want to deal with it. Let's outsource it. Let's not deal with it. That's the wrong approach, obviously. You can't outsource your risk in this area. And, my strong advice to those organizations that want to, put their hands in front of their eyes and not look at it, we're on a collision course. You're on a collision course with the intersection of these threats. So, those are some observations. I'm not speaking about, those boards that have highly technical, well-trained cyber experts advising them. I just know that there's a lot of companies that need a lot of help in this area.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. But I also think that we talk about these sort of systemic changes. We recommend these sort of systemic changes in the way that we think about cyber threats and making it a part of your everyday business to understand what your assets are and those assets that you need to protect most, the prioritization of that process. And it seems like a huge mountain to climb for a lot of companies that are still really not in that game. But, Norman, I would remind people that we've all been through this before. If going back to, 9/11, right? In the days and months and years after 9/11, the entire country changed the way it thinks about its physical security posture, right? Before 9/11, you could go into the airport, you could walk right up to any gate and greet your relatives after they got off the plane. You could pretty much take anything anywhere. After 9/11, we live in a world where private companies, private sector entities understand physical security, don't allow people to come in without identifying themselves, providing identification, connecting with someone who may have invited them or called them in for a meeting or something like that. So these are things that we take for granted now as just a fact of life. I think it's not unrealistic to hope that 10 years from now, maybe the sort of cybersecurity protection steps that we're discussing will also be just a normal factor of day-to-day business, understood by people from the frontline defenders all the way up to those folks sitting on the board. So it's just a matter of keeping the conversation going and get people thinking in the right direction. But I think it's entirely doable.
Yeah, that's a very optimistic, and I think appropriately optimistic way to look at it, Andy. Thank you for that perspective. I see we're starting to get a couple of questions in here. Maybe I'll do one last question, then we're going to open it up to the questions in the group, and Eric's going to help us. So there's been a lot of talk. If we look at even to your point just now, Andy, if we look at like a lot of times where the advancements come from, you said a lot of the infrastructure in the US is owned by private companies. There's a lot of innovation that occurs, and sometimes that's borrowed by government entities. Be really curious in terms of either what you've seen at the FBI or at the US Postal Service, what are some strategies that you think that the private sector could borrow from the public sector?
I would say first, and really foundationally, Norman, one of those strategies that I saw develop during my time in the FBI, particularly in my last decade or so of service, is completely rethinking about not just the cyber threat writ large, but how our organization dealt with technology. We've had our struggles in the past, there's no doubt about that. But understanding the really groundbreaking change socially, societally, introduced by things like ubiquitous internet access, by social media, by changes in communications techniques and encrypted communications, realizing that like cyber was not just a division in the FBI that had really smart computer people and did these esoteric cases about crimes that the rest of us didn't understand, but was actually a piece of everything that we did. To protecting ourselves, to helping protect our partners in the intelligence community, and literally every case from the most basic, criminal bank robbery, extortion scheme, what have you, all the way up to the most sophisticated state-sponsored cyber activity. The impact of encrypted communications, of social media, of the way that those technologies changed the way human beings interacted, forced us to step up our game in terms of understanding that space and be able to react to it. And I think it would help if, certain sectors of certain parts of the private sector thought that same way about changing their approach to their own safety, their own security, and the way they deliver their goods and services. A lot of sectors are already there, the financial services sector, others, places, highly regulated sectors are obviously more sophisticated than others. But, as we start talking about those pieces of the critical infrastructure chain that maybe we don't think about every day, like, the JBS hack or Colonial Pipeline, there are serious vulnerabilities packed into the way that we live every day. And we've got to really kind of export that change in perspective on the impact of cyber on everything that we do.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that Andrew and I are very passionate about is really taking that threat-led approach to cybersecurity and using that intelligence cycle that we leveraged in the government and applying that to protect our assets. That's what I did at the Postal Service. I had access to great intelligence, not only from the work that I had done, but also in collaboration with other law enforcement organizations and the intelligence community through my dear friend Andrew. And how do you take that information, understand how that relates to the specific assets that you hold, the computer equipment, the applications, the data that you hold as an organization, and how do you see how those threat actors will impact those assets, and then develop mitigation strategies and apply those mitigation strategies from a prioritization perspective to make your investments, and then, be able to communicate. One of the things that, I get up on the soapbox about is the ability to communicate with senior leaders about these issues in a way that they understand, as opposed to the way that the technologists want to explain it. And, one of the things that I hope that you see from what we've talked about for the last 45 minutes is this is not a technology issue. For 25 years, as a law enforcement officer, I investigated the use of computers as an instrumentality of crime. It is a threat and a crime problem that we attempt to deal with technology solutions. And so, that's always what we're trying to tell our clients, that you need to understand your threat, you need to respond to the threat, and you need to constantly communicate and improve in order to be able to be effective at this game.
Yeah, excellent point, Greg. I think we have these conversations a lot, not only with our customers, but even in developing our product, is how do we figure out an effective way? I mean, we have lots of great representation here today. We've got threat analysts, we've got CISOs, we may have some board members as well. And I think figuring out how to get everyone, communicating in a way in which people have the right appreciation for the severity and the risk is important. And so I think, to my earlier question, I think you did finally answer it. It's about the people and not the tech.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, let's open it up to some of those questions. Eric, would you walk us through, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start with one of my own questions. I'm going to cheat a little bit because I do have something that we've talked about kind of throughout. And we've talked a lot about generative AI. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is there's this debate right now in the States. I'm sure you guys have read about it, in terms of like, should we slow down? Should there be a moratorium? Should we take a minute and pause? And then you'll hear on the other side, well, no, if we pause, like China's going to keep going and they're going to build stuff that's way better than ours. And I would just be interested in your take, like both Greg and Andrew, like your takes on this kind of like dilemma almost. Because to me, it feels like we're moving ahead with something that has very uncertain outcomes very, 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 very quickly. And we're not really sure what it's going to do. I think there's a huge amount of uncertainty. But at the same time, I can also respect that we don't want to lose this kind of competitive edge that we seem to have, at least for this moment. So I would love to hear both of your takes, so that I promise I will ask audience questions.
Yeah, I'll start it off, Eric. I think it's a bit like trying to negotiate a ceasefire, right? You have the same problems, like getting everybody to lay down their arms at the same time and step away is always tough, because invariably one or several of the players involved sees an advantage to themselves to continue fighting while everybody else has their arms on the ground. So we're in a very similar situation here. I don't hold out a lot of hope. Maybe here's my less optimistic point in the webinar. I don't hold out a lot of hope for the pause theory. However, I strongly support the idea that, okay, maybe while we're all pursuing our own programs and our own development of different tools, we spend an equal amount of time talking about how we should all think about moving forward in that space in a way that doesn't create additional risk. You see it in the medical community. You see it with the development of things like genetic therapies and things like that. There are boards and forums in which economic competitors get together and discuss the ethics around the development that they're doing. And I think it might be helpful for the tech sector to think the same way about the development of AI. So I don't know, Greg, if you see it differently.
Yeah, I love your analogy. I helped my son this weekend write a paper about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis on the relations between the United States and Russia. And when you think about where we're at relative to the use of this technology, we have to go forward. We have to continue to build our arms. We have to continue to build those control mechanisms that we need. We're too early in the development life cycle of this technology to slow down. A year is going to be equivalent to probably 3 years from a technology cycle perspective, because things are moving so much faster. And I don't think that we can slow down. I think that we have to devise those safety mechanisms, and we have to accelerate out of the turn here and go as fast as we can. Otherwise, I believe that the adversarial use of these technologies will outpace us significantly, and I don't think that we can fall behind. So that I'm very pessimistic relative to the ideals of privacy and security in the face of the use of these technologies, because I've spent too much time thinking about how our adversaries are going to be leveraging just an extension of the compute and tech in order to be able to get an advantage.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. Thank you. And yeah, so a ceasefire and the Cuban Missile Crisis were the two big topics I got out of there. I'd give you a third one, which is I'm reading a book right now called The Making of the Atomic Bomb. And it strikes me as there's like a lot of parallels between the two. Like a bunch of scientists racing to create something. They're not really sure what the in the case of the atomic bomb, they thought there was like a non-zero chance it might blow up the entire atmosphere, but we'll figure it out when we test it. So just a small one. Exactly. So we have some great questions from the audience. I'll start out with outside of the 4 countries that were identified, I think it was China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. What are there any other actors that are rapidly increasing their offensive cyber capabilities? Are there any countries outside of that we see that are really like trying to up their game on offensive cyber?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly other international actors that are leaders in the cyber development field, whether it's offensive or defensive. The difference is that most of those countries are allies of the United States. So some of that development takes place transparently between the two nations, others less so, but nevertheless, those technologies remain in the hands of actors who we cooperate with and work proactively with. Obviously name your EU nation and then add Israel to that pile, and you have probably a good sense of who are the strongest players in those fields.
I think a little down under.
A little down under and a little up, right?
Yeah.
It's a standard Five Eyes approach, and then everybody else. But really, I mean, I think I've been really following this issue with NSO and the development of technology and Israel surveillance technology. I mean, I think that Israel is at the absolute cutting edge of cyber development right now, and I'd put them up against any adversary right now. That's my own pick.
Awesome, thank you. I have another question. I think this one is more geared towards Greg. Greg, you made a really interesting statement earlier about kind of like, I'll read the question. I think you'll get where it's going. Did I understand right that the available AI systems are trained with Western values / mindset, and AI trained with Chinese cultural mindset will be a major social engineering and maybe technology challenge? And I will tell you what this question calls to mind is like, TikTok, like the Chinese government puts like a little bot in TikTok that has like, not like overtly, not like the Communist Party is the greatest entity in the world, but like, something a little bit more subtle that could kind of influence people's attitudes and beliefs as they use these kind of applications. So I think they're looking for you to expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw the use of AI in street. A Chinese implementation of AI was the demonstration of shaming people for jaywalking on the streets in China, and using video and facial recognition to put the name of the person that was jaywalking up on a sign as they jaywalked across the street, kind of immediate feedback from, a violation in the context of their community. That would be completely not accepted here in the West, right? But it's those differences from a use perspective that we need to consider. And when you look at the types of attacks that are okay in the values and morals of the Chinese leadership, they're going to get installed in the artificial intelligence systems that they're developing. So the theft of intellectual property is going to be a major concern, for example, for anybody that's using a Chinese generated large language model for their business. So I would be very careful about what I'm putting in as prompts to those types of technologies that are being developed. And you can just, I'm afraid that I can't conceptualize everything that will ultimately develop from the instantiation of those values and morals into those systems.
No, that's an excellent answer. Thank you. And I think the last question we're going to go to is, who can small private sector businesses, citizens go to for protection and incident recovery, since local law enforcement often doesn't have the resources or the ability to help in kind of a meaningful way?
Well, I'll hit my one FBI plug here. So no matter the size of the business, there is an FBI field office or resident agency, which is a sub office that services every inch of this country. And the FBI is an easy to remember and easy to execute plugin for your cyber issues. The level of coordination between the FBI and DHS and other U.S. government entities in the cyberspace it's not perfect. It's far from perfect, but it's much better today than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And you can essentially plug into that system, at least in terms of conveying logic complaints, IC3 and other entities, and then following up on investigative activity that might be generated as a result of your complaint. You're more likely to get to be able to access resources, cyber-specific resources at the Bureau than you would be in most local state and local police entities.
And one additional, is outside counsel. It's very important to call your lawyer first in order to be able to protect your interests. SolarWinds was a small company, right? Small private owned company, big impacts, right?
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. And third-party risk is definitely a huge concern for a lot of folks. All right, I think we're kind of coming up on time here. Andy, Greg, do you guys have any last parting thoughts you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, sure. Good luck. It's tough out there. And it's not going to get any easier. So, you build your teams, work your intelligence cycle, think about the most important things you have to protect and focus on those, because you can't catch everything, and take advantage of the advice and the tools that are out there. Greg and I are 10-8 Cyber. We're always here to help. As per our name, 10-8 was the law enforcement code for in service, and we are here to serve. So with that, I'll hand it over to my partner.
You said it all. Thanks, Andrew.
Awesome. Norman, do you any closing thoughts?
Just a thank you first to our audience for joining us here today, and then a special thank you to Greg and Andy as well. Really appreciate all your insights, sharing your experiences with us, and thank you for taking some very interesting questions and so artfully responding to them. So it was very informative. It was a pleasure. Thank you again.
Thank you so much,
guys.